this great inheritance and of the duties and heavy responsibilities of sovereignty, which have now passed to my beloved daughter.
The envelope looked ordinary, but the words inside it carried the weight of a reign. In one extraordinary legal confirmation, solicitors handling Queen Elizabeth II's private arrangements declared that Catherine, not Camilla, would inherit the contents and custodial rights connected to Elizabeth's private crown vault. For Catherine, the announcement brought stunned silence. For Camilla, it landed like a personal rejection from beyond the grave. And within minutes, the atmosphere inside the royal household changed completely. Before we go deeper into what this really means for the royal family, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss a single update. Catherine read the paragraph again beside William, then lowered the page without speaking. The private crown vault, a fictional collection separate from the official crown jewels, contained personal heirlooms, historic pieces, handwritten inventories, family objects, and ceremonial items Elizabeth had controlled. The crown jewels are state-held regalia used for coronations and major ceremonies. This collection was different because it belonged to the late monarch's private legacy. The solicitor's confirmation was unmistakable. Catherine had been named inheritor and future custodian, while Camilla held no ownership or final authority over its contents. William watched her face as the meaning settled in. She did not smile or speak of victory. Instead, the future queen seemed burdened by what had been placed in her hands, because custodianship meant preserving Elizabeth's wishes rather than simply possessing valuable objects. The prince asked whether she wanted a moment alone. Catherine shook her head and returned to one phrase in the legal wording: direct line of personal custodianship. It sounded deliberate. It sounded final. Camilla received her own summary elsewhere, and her expression hardened immediately. The queen consort, the title used for the wife of a reigning king, reached the sentence stating that the collection would pass directly to Catherine, and stopped. Charles remained beside her as she read it again. He understood that private legal instructions formally recorded by solicitors could not simply be rewritten because the outcome caused pain. The king placed his copy on the table and said nothing. Silence made the decision heavier. Camilla closed the folder, pushed it several inches away, and stared at Charles as though the real wound had only just appeared. So she had already decided, she said quietly. He did not contradict her. His mother had anticipated a future dispute and drawn the boundary herself. Camilla's next question changed everything. When had Elizabeth chosen Catherine over her, and why? That question would drag everyone away from the legal document in front of them and toward the far more painful issue behind it, what Elizabeth had seen in Catherine, and what she had feared might happen after her death. The legal decision was explosive, because this was never merely about jewels. It was about trust, memory, legitimacy, and the invisible hierarchy Elizabeth had left behind. Catherine stood on one side of that legacy as the future queen who had spent years learning the rhythms of royal duty. Camilla stood on the other, as the woman who had fought for decades to reach the heart of the monarchy. Now one private inheritance seemed to measure them against each other. Catherine folded the solicitor's letter carefully and slid it back into the envelope. William watched her without interrupting, already sensing that she did not see the inheritance as a victory. Years of preparation had taught her that future queenship meant carrying duties long before wearing a crown, while her relationship with Elizabeth had slowly brought her into family traditions that were personal rather than constitutional. Those private traditions mattered because they dealt with memory, trust, and objects connected to generations of family history, not simply formal royal rank. Catherine finally looked at William and admitted what frightened her most. She told him the collection felt less like something she had inherited and more like something she could never afford to mishandle. The prince understood immediately. He remembered a private recorded family conversation from years earlier, when Elizabeth had told her that some royal objects belonged to memory before they belonged to rank. At the time, the sentence had sounded reflective. Now it sounded like a warning, deliberately left behind. Camilla felt the same words very differently. She removed her glasses, pressed 2 fingers against her forehead, and turned toward Charles with an expression that was no longer angry so much as wounded. After years of public scrutiny, rejection, and eventual acceptance beside him, becoming queen had seemed to close the oldest chapter of doubt around her place. The queen consort was the wife of the reigning monarch, a position carrying status and public duty. Yet this private exclusion suggested Elizabeth had still drawn a boundary somewhere deeper. Camilla asked the question slowly. "Was I ever meant to have a say?" Charles did not answer immediately. He had heard similar concerns before, but now there was nowhere for silence to hide. Charles finally admitted that his mother had discussed preserving certain family pieces beyond the automatic influence of whoever occupied the senior royal household after her death. The king explained that these conversations had been documented privately, and Elizabeth had been unusually firm about separating personal inheritance from ceremonial position. Camilla stared at him, realizing he had known there were limits, even if he had not known exactly how far they went. William then remembered another detail. A former household record had mentioned one specific disagreement over a historic family piece. An incident serious enough for Elizabeth to request changes to her private instructions soon afterward. The room seemed to contract around that revelation. Catherine looked toward the sealed envelope again. Camilla looked at Charles. The answer lay several years in the past, in one private confrontation that transformed Elizabeth's quiet concerns into a decision she would never reverse. Every inheritance has a beginning, and this one began long before the solicitors opened their files. The decisive moment came during a private family gathering, when a disagreement over one historic heirloom forced Elizabeth to confront a question she had carefully avoided. Who could be trusted with the monarchy's most personal treasures when she was gone? What happened that evening was small enough to escape public notice, but powerful enough to alter the future. Elizabeth had always treated certain family pieces differently from objects held for official royal use. Many carried memories of her parents, Philip, earlier generations, and private milestones that mattered far beyond their monetary value. Provenance. The recorded history of where an object came from, who owned it, and why it mattered, was especially important to her because those records protected meaning as much as ownership. Catherine had gradually been invited to study those histories, learning why some objects could be worn freely, while others were tied to promises made decades earlier. Camilla changed the atmosphere that evening when she asked for a historic family necklace to be reassigned for an upcoming ceremonial appearance. She expected the request to be straightforward. Catherine noticed that the piece had been listed differently in Elizabeth's handwritten custodial instructions, meaning the monarch had personally recorded how it should be handled. Rather than allow the change to proceed, she quietly returned the necklace to its designated case. Camilla immediately felt challenged. She told Elizabeth that the future princess should not be deciding what the queen consort might use, and the remark landed harder than she intended. The monarch did not raise her voice. Instead, she explained that rank was not the issue. The problem was respect for intention, history, and the promises attached to objects that had passed through the family for generations. Elizabeth waited until the room had emptied before removing her spectacles and looking directly at Catherine. "Preserving something sometimes means knowing when not to claim it," she said. The sentence stayed with the younger woman because it sounded less like advice about jewelry and more like a lesson about power itself. Catherine did not know that the conversation was about to become something far more permanent. Later that night, Elizabeth privately asked her dresser to bring the vault inventory. A dresser in the royal household helps manage clothing, jewelry, and personal ceremonial items. often keeping detailed records of what is used and when. According to the fictional documented account, the monarch made a handwritten amendment beside Catherine's name and instructed that the change be preserved with the private file. Within days, solicitors were directed to revise the custodial arrangement so the collection would pass directly to Catherine and avoid future disagreement over control. Camilla was never told that the Windsor argument had triggered the amendment. Years later, that forgotten Windsor evening was no longer a private memory. It had become evidence, and Camilla was about to confront Catherine over what she believed had been kept from her. Camilla did not explode when she discovered the Windsor Amendment. Her reaction was colder. She asked for Catherine to meet her privately, closed the door after the last aide left, and placed the solicitor's chronology between them. One date had been marked in pencil. One old disagreement had suddenly acquired enormous meaning. Then came the question Catherine had been dreading from the beginning. Did you know what Elizabeth had done? Catherine looked at the marked page before answering. The solicitor's chronology was simply a dated legal record showing when instructions had been given, changed, and confirmed. But this entry carried more weight, because it sat only days after the Windsor disagreement. She understood why Camilla saw the timing as personal. She also knew the arrangement could not now be changed, and she had no intention of using Elizabeth's wishes as a weapon against another woman in the family. Camilla tapped the page once with her finger. "You expect me to believe this meant nothing?" she asked. Catherine did not raise her voice. "No, I think it meant everything to her." The Queen Consort's expression tightened, because that answer cut deeper than denial. She accused Catherine of benefiting from a decision born in the exact moment she had been corrected, embarrassed, and made to feel that her future position carried less authority than she believed. Catherine held her ground. She said she had never requested the collection and had not known the full legal wording until the solicitor's letter arrived. The future queen then explained that Elizabeth had spoken to her privately after Windsor about stewardship, meaning the duty to protect something for the future rather than treat it as personal property. But the monarch had never told her that Camilla would be excluded from final authority. That distinction mattered, because Catherine had believed she was being taught responsibility, not being chosen over someone else. Camilla opened another page and pointed to the date of the handwritten amendment. Catherine's name had been entered within days of their disagreement. The connection was impossible to dismiss now. Anger gave way to something more vulnerable. She asked whether Elizabeth had already decided that one mistake proved she could never be trusted with the collection. The door opened before Catherine could answer. Charles entered with a tension that immediately changed the room. He looked at the papers, then at both women, and understood exactly where the conversation had reached. Charles finally broke his silence through a private family account he had kept from that period. Elizabeth had spoken to him directly about Windsor. She had explained why the incident troubled her, why Catherine's restraint mattered, and why she wanted the private collection protected from future disputes over rank. Camilla stared at him in disbelief. Catherine said nothing. But Elizabeth had not left her reasoning buried entirely in legal paperwork, because Charles had heard the explanation directly, and what he remembered would shift the argument from rivalry to royal authority. Charles had remained quiet while the dispute deepened, but silence was no longer possible. Elizabeth had spoken to him about the private collection before her death. Not once, but repeatedly. She had known that rank, marriage, succession, and sentiment could collide after she was gone, and she had constructed the arrangement accordingly. When Charles finally explained what his mother had told him, Camilla realized the inheritance had never been designed as an insult. It had been designed as a safeguard. Charles kept his voice controlled as he explained that Elizabeth's personally owned collection did not automatically follow ceremonial rank. Private legal arrangements allowed her to decide who would inherit, preserve, and manage those pieces after her death. The king said his mother had deliberately separated constitutional position, the official place someone holds within the monarchy, from personal custodianship, which meant responsibility for protecting privately owned family objects according to her wishes. To Elizabeth, the two forms of authority were never automatically the same. Camilla listened without interrupting, but the hurt remained. Charles could see it, and that made every sentence harder. He wanted to protect his wife from feeling rejected, yet he also knew his mother had made the decision with unmistakable clarity. When the Queen Consort finally asked whether he had ever challenged Elizabeth on her behalf, the monarch hesitated. That pause wounded her more deeply than an immediate answer. William watched his father struggle and understood the impossible position he was in. The prince could see loyalty pulling Charles in two directions, toward the woman beside him and toward the final wishes of the woman who had shaped his entire life. The silence stretched until the king finally admitted the truth. He had questioned the arrangement during a private recorded family conversation, and Elizabeth had refused to change it. Charles remembered her reasoning almost word for word. Catherine, she had told him, understood that inheritance carried obligations before privileges. His mother believed the future queen would protect the collection without confusing access with ownership. Camilla lowered her eyes at that explanation, because the decision suddenly sounded less like rejection and more like a judgment about how power should be handled. Charles then opened the solicitor's instructions. The document allowed Catherine to preserve, catalog, loan, and eventually pass designated pieces onward according to Elizabeth's written wishes. Cataloging simply meant formally recording each object, its history, and its approved use, so nothing could quietly disappear or be reassigned without explanation. This was real authority, not an honorary gesture. Charles set his mother's memorandum beside Camilla's hand and said with visible exhaustion, she knew exactly what she was doing. William looked toward Catherine as the final consequence became clear. Palace staff had already received new instructions. Nothing from the private collection could be moved, worn, photographed, or reassigned without her authorization. And once Elizabeth's instructions moved from private explanation to active palace procedure, Camilla faced the reality she had resisted from the beginning. Catherine's inheritance was no longer symbolic. The first consequence arrived without ceremony. A scheduled selection of historic pieces for an upcoming royal engagement was paused. Staff who once would have handled the matter routinely now required Catherine's written approval because several requested items belonged to Elizabeth's private collection. It was a procedural change, measured in signatures and inventory numbers, but when Camilla heard the words "authorization required," the full reality finally became impossible to deny. Palace staff began separating Catherine's inherited collection from items belonging to other royal holdings, drawing a firm administrative line around what Elizabeth had privately controlled. Royal holdings are objects managed for official or family use, rather than treated as one person's personal property. And that difference now mattered, because every request had to follow the correct chain of authority. Catherine immediately asked that nothing be moved dramatically or displayed differently. She wanted continuity, not a palace spectacle that made the change look like a public transfer of power. Camilla tested that new reality almost by accident. She requested a familiar historic piece for an upcoming engagement and expected the usual quiet approval. Instead, an aide informed her that the item could not leave storage until Catherine gave written permission. The Queen Consort went still. She could have called Charles. She could have demanded that the king intervene. Instead, she withdrew the request, unwilling to create the image of herself asking permission from the woman who now controlled something Elizabeth had once allowed her to use. Catherine learned what had happened before the request disappeared from the system. She understood immediately how humiliating the moment must have felt, and quietly signed the authorization anyway. The future queen did not attach conditions, demand recognition, or ask for the decision to be announced. She simply approved the piece and added a short handwritten message, making clear that Elizabeth's wishes were not going to become a weapon in her hands. Camilla received the note while preparing for the engagement, and stopped. The approved jewelry box was brought into the room, but she did not open it immediately. Her fingers rested on the lid as she read Catherine's message again. Her wishes should preserve the family, not divide it. The words unsettled her because restraint was harder to fight than aggression. Camilla sat alone for several minutes. The argument she had been carrying, that Catherine had gained power and might use it against her, suddenly became harder to sustain. The younger woman had been given every opportunity to make the new hierarchy visible and had chosen not to. Something shifted in that silence. Camilla no longer wanted another conversation with Charles, solicitors, or advisors interpreting Catherine's intentions for her. For the first time since the solicitor's announcement, anger gave way to something more difficult: recognition. And Camilla decided Catherine deserved an answer face to face. There were no aides in the room this time, no lawyers, no briefing papers, no Charles or William to soften a sentence before it landed. Camilla had asked Catherine to meet her alone because the argument could no longer be solved through documents. What began as a dispute over inheritance had exposed older wounds: acceptance, succession, insecurity, and the fear of being judged by a woman who was no longer alive to explain herself. Camilla spoke first. She admitted that Catherine's decision to authorize the heirloom had changed the way she saw the inheritance. The younger woman had held the power to make the new arrangement feel humiliating, and had chosen restraint instead. Catherine answered that she viewed Elizabeth's collection as a family trust in spirit, meaning something held for the benefit and memory of others, even though the legal custodial rights belonged to one person. She had no desire to turn that responsibility into a personal trophy. Camilla's voice softened as she finally explained what had shattered her. It was never simply about losing access to jewelry. She had survived years of public suspicion, fought for acceptance beside Charles, and believed Elizabeth's eventual support had closed the deepest wounds of the past. Discovering that the late monarch had still maintained a private boundary around her made that acceptance feel suddenly incomplete. Catherine understood the pain, but she carried one of her own. She admitted that being chosen had placed her inside a different kind of trap. Every decision she made would now be judged as either loyalty to Elizabeth or hostility toward Camilla. If she restricted access, she would appear ruthless. If she ignored the instructions, she would betray the woman who had trusted her. There was no easy version of the responsibility. Camilla then revealed how she remembered the Windsor disagreement. In her own private account of that evening, she had believed she was exercising the authority expected of her future position, not deliberately ignoring Elizabeth's wishes. That difference mattered. Catherine listened before sharing what the monarch had told her afterward. Stewardship meant knowing when possession should stop and responsibility should begin. The meaning landed differently now. Camilla finally understood why that moment had stayed with Elizabeth. It was not about punishing one request. It was about how each woman understood power. Camilla reached toward the authorization note, folded it once, and looked directly at Catherine. "Keep her wishes intact. Just don't let them turn us into enemies." Catherine agreed. Together, they decided the collection would remain under her custodianship, but be described publicly as Elizabeth's family legacy, never as one woman's victory over another. Their private understanding could calm the family, but outside palace walls the story had already escaped, and the world was preparing to turn Elizabeth's quiet decision into a royal earthquake. By morning, the private inheritance was private no longer. The distinction between crown property and Elizabeth's personal collection barely survived the first wave of headlines. To the public, the story was brutally simple. Catherine had inherited something Camilla had expected to control. Within hours, television panels were debating succession, crowds were gathering near royal gates, and one newspaper front page reduced years of private family history to 4 enormous words. Catherine watched the coverage with growing discomfort. Palace communications moved quickly to explain that the private crown vault remained separate from the constitutional crown jewels, meaning the official regalia used for coronations and state ceremonies were not part of this inheritance. The clarification also stressed that Camilla's formal position beside Charles had not changed, yet the emotional meaning refused to disappear. Commentators saw Elizabeth's decision as a powerful sign of trust in the future generation represented by Catherine. William urged her not to react to every headline. The prince understood that any emotional response would be interpreted as either triumph or defensiveness. Catherine agreed, but the language still troubled her. She had never asked to become the winner of a public contest, and yet every headline seemed determined to create one. The future queen read one description of Camilla as frozen out, and immediately knew how much damage those words could undo. Camilla felt that damage personally. She had only just reached an understanding with Catherine, but now strangers were turning the inheritance into a humiliation she had privately begun to accept. The queen consort saw herself described as rejected, and the old wound opened again. Charles stayed close, reminding her that headlines could not rewrite the conversation that had already happened behind closed doors. Outside Buckingham Palace, the story reached its most vivid public moment. Television cameras caught visitors holding copies of a fictional morning newspaper carrying the front-page words, "Elizabeth chose Catherine," above side-by-side photographs of the two women. A broadcaster cut through the debate to stress that the legal arrangement concerned private property, not the crown itself. The correction mattered, but the image had already captured the public imagination. Catherine watched the broadcast only briefly. She switched off the television before the panel finished and looked at William. "This cannot become her final message to the family," she said. The prince understood immediately. The palace soon issued a carefully worded statement, emphasizing continuity, stewardship, and respect for Elizabeth's private wishes, rather than rivalry. Catherine then rejected suggestions that she appear publicly wearing one of the inherited pieces. She would not turn restraint into spectacle. That choice began to change the tone. So the final decision would not be made by journalists, lawyers, or headlines. It would be made by what Catherine chose to do with the inheritance Elizabeth had placed in her hands. The story began with a legal document that seemed to create a winner and a loser. It ended with something far more revealing. Catherine had received Elizabeth's private crown vault, but inheritance alone did not define the victory. What mattered was how she chose to carry it. Camilla had been excluded from ownership, yet the final days of turmoil forced both women to understand the distinction Elizabeth had been protecting all along. Possession was temporary. Stewardship was the legacy. Catherine signed the final acceptance and closed the inventory ledger with deliberate care. The archive would remain intact, with Elizabeth's handwritten provenance notes attached, so future generations would know where each object came from, who had worn it, and why it mattered. Those records turned the collection into more than jewelry. They preserved family memory, personal history, and the late Queen's intentions, in a form that could not easily be rewritten. Camilla stood nearby and understood that the argument had finally reached its end. Catherine told her privately that inherited authority would never be used to erase her place beside Charles or reduce her standing within the family. The future queen had control of the collection, but she would not turn that control into domination. For the queen consort, that distinction mattered more now than it had at the beginning. Camilla accepted what she had resisted for days. Elizabeth's choice could not be undone, and asking Charles to challenge it again would only reopen wounds that had begun to close. The pain remained because the decision still reminded her that the late monarch had drawn a private boundary around certain parts of her legacy. But she no longer treated that boundary as an attack. William saw something else in Catherine's response. The prince recognized the inheritance as a rehearsal for the greater responsibility waiting ahead, holding power without allowing power to become possession. That lesson became even clearer when one deeply personal piece connected to Elizabeth was designated for future ceremonial use by the women of the family under Catherine's custodianship. The collection would serve as a bridge between generations, not as a trophy belonging to one side. Catherine closed the final ledger after signing her acceptance. Camilla looked toward the sealed collection, then turned back to her. "She trusted you with it. Protect it." "I will," Catherine replied. That simple exchange settled what lawyers, headlines, and arguments could not. Elizabeth's decision had never crowned Catherine above Camilla. It had defined two different forms of royal standing. One woman's place beside the reigning king, and another woman's responsibility for carrying a deeply personal part of the late queen's legacy forward. For Camilla, the solicitor's confirmation began as a devastating reminder that Elizabeth had maintained limits even after accepting her into the monarchy's highest circle. For Catherine, it became neither a prize nor a declaration of superiority, but a test of restraint. And for the monarchy, the meaning was unmistakable. Elizabeth's final authority survived not because her possessions remained locked away, but because the responsibility attached to them had been deliberately passed forward. The vault belonged to Catherine, the memory belonged to the family, and at last, both women understood the difference. Thanks for watching. Please don't forget to like and subscribe, and we will see you in next one.